Welcome, Left Reckoning patrons. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, Dave Griscom. Hello, Dave.
Hey, brother.
And joining us now, excited to get, very back to episode 1 of Left Reckoning sort of topic here. Keith Orejel. Keith is an assistant professor at Wilmington College, focusing on, I'd say, like the political economy of rural America. Is that accurate?
I think that's 100% accurate. Yeah, nail on the head there.
All right. So, well, as Left Reckoners know, demystifying this idea, because David and I both grew up, David's living in Texas now, I grew up in North Dakota. This idea that there's like a red state versus blue state divide in rural America is a certain type of way. We want to kind of get into a more materialist understanding of these sorts of things. So I guess just to start off, Keith, how should we understand rural America in our country's political economy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there has been just like a real big revolution in the place of rural spaces within the American political economy since World War II, right? Historically, the role of rural areas had always been as sort of an extractive economy, right? These sort of producers of agricultural commodities and raw materials that then are being sort of sent to urban places or abroad to be sort of processed. And I think that, rural America had sort of fundamentally different structures and fundamentally different employment, right? People would be engaged in mining, in forestry, in agriculture, that really sort of separated them from urban peoples. Now, what you've seen since World War II is a really fascinating sort of dichotomy, where on the one hand, there has been this incredible convergence between rural and urban spaces, right? With the decline in agricultural employment, with the sort of shriveling up of mining and forestry jobs, and the sort of widespread industrialization and expansion of the service sector within rural areas, thinking vis-a-vis things like, J.B. Hunt trucking, Walmart, stuff like that. In a lot of ways, rural areas have come to resemble urban spaces much more. So what I would sort of argue is there's been, to some extent, this really incredible sort of change that there's not really a major difference in kind, right? But at the same time, there's almost been a widening of the difference in degree, which is what we've seen in the last several decades is, the sort of, especially since 2008, is the sort of flourishing and growth within metropolitan areas, and where significantly they've gotten like a monopoly on like the really high-end industries and sectors within the American economy. So think about like finance, real estate, tech, information. All of those are really sort of wedded to these metropolitan spaces because of their advanced infrastructural, their sort of scientific college talent and things like that. And rural America has kind of just become like the repository of what's left over, right? It's almost like rural America is like the Wario or like Bizarro Superman of urban economies. It's like this warped, sort of askew alter image where what it really has is a lot of industries that tend to be sort of stagnating or even declining. Manufacturing, which used to be its big linchpin, has been like really plummeting since 2000. A lot of sort of retail, a lot of food services, a lot of sort of other just kind of bottom of the barrel. And to some extent, I think this is a big crux of why we've developed this really intense rural urban divide, right? In many ways, this sense that like they're doing the same kinds of work, they work in the same sectors. There's not this clear structural materialist difference between their lifestyles or their day-to-day lives, but there is just this tremendous divide in terms of prosperity, in terms of wealth, in terms of quality of living, that I think that drives just a lot of sort of frustration and anger from those who, as is awfully said, feel like they've been left behind.
And I think that like one point that people were making a lot that I think really like highlights what you're getting at here was, the past couple of years when we were seeing like that strike wave. I don't know if we want to call it a strike wave, but like a lot of these big strikes were happening in like rural parts of the country versus most people, might be expecting it to be the opposite.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think there has been, sort of a lot of, frustration from the rural working class about just, the quality of what's available in terms of work within their universes. The fact that, yeah, I mean, a lot of them being sort of presumably sort of wildcat operations and things like that, because, you know, that's been another big difference since World War II is, you know, the New Deal model being the sort of urban industrial unionization, go for the big industries, the big plants, that when a lot of factories began sort of dispersing out to the countryside during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that was a very difficult shift for the sort of traditional union framework to deal with, right? It's much harder to go out and sort of organize 50 small branch plants. And that was an intentional decision made by sort of management. And yeah, I think you have seen a lot of sort of energy coming from these rural working class sectors, as the realization is that, like, you know, you're going to have to sort of improve your position with what's available in these areas, because it does not seem like there's, you know, a ton of sort of economic development or growth basically taking place. Yeah.
Yeah, Keith, how regional is this dynamic? Because, you know, when you describe this, my mom comes from a small farming town, Hankinson, North Dakota. There were dairy farmers and, you know, other things. And that just wasn't, like, to me growing up, like, and like particularly in like the neoliberal period, my impression is monopolization and just continued like consolidation basically like destroyed that as a life path. So like growing up, I didn't like, frankly, going to the farm. I like to be in the big city of Bismarck because you know, there's more stuff to do there. And like I interpreted it kind of like a cultural thing. But my mom was there in Bismarck because the jobs were there in Bismarck.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, that's even, I mean, the farm population has just you know, shriveled. It is just this, since World War II, just a relentless, almost unstoppable force of consolidation in farms into fewer and fewer. I don't even know what the numbers are today. I mean, I've seen them as low as, like, you know, less than 5% of rural communities are in agriculture, right? We may be down to just like a couple million farmers left in the whole country, right? And yeah, I mean, basically, even many people that consider themselves to have a farm or be in agriculture, most of their income comes from this off the farm work. They travel to the local small town that's really becomes the source of like their livelihood. And that's really the story of kind of the countryside after World War II. I remember one study, I think, put it very poignantly, which is like historically the relationship between town and country is that the farmers produce the wealth and the money and they spend it in the town that reaps the sort of benefits of their production. Whereas now the relationship is like the town produces the wealth. The town is where all the jobs are, and people are like commuting in from the countryside to basically look for these works. And, you know, maybe it's a manufacturing plant, what's still left, maybe it's a Walmart, maybe it's a fast food establishment, right? That there's been this real kind of role reversal. And that, like you said, it's become this weird thing. I always ask people, I was like, oh, I live on a farm. I was like, oh, well, like, do you grow anything? And they're like, no. I was like, so I'm like, so you basically just have a house in the countryside, right? And that's kind of what most people use rural spaces for, is basically just as essentially a housing site. Living on a few acres is the much more common, I think, framework for what people use these, you know, sort of dispersed areas for.
Yeah, and you shared on Twitter, Keith D. Orejel on Twitter, we'll share that. But I shared this interesting map. Prime age working population change in rural counties, 2010 to 2019. And it is pretty not great for most of the country. And so, as we can say, like, as you described, it's pretty widespread. But
I couldn't hear you there. Dave, could you hear him?
I could. I think we're getting some feedback there.
Let me
Matt,
see.
we're getting feedback from you because your sound's sharing on the screen. That's what's happening.
Oh, gotcha. Let me retry that here. I'll do that without this sound share. Sorry about that. Is this any better?
Yeah.
Keith, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, all right. I'm going to mute Keith because I think I'm getting a little feedback there. But just to put this up real quick, and then I'll let Keith describe it. But the blue area is oil. So it's not like North Dakota, that's the Bakken oil field. So that's where people are moving to North Dakota and kind of insulating my home state from a lot of the last decade's difficulty with economics. So just talk about this map for us, Keith.
So, I mean, this has been a persistent problem for rural places since, throughout the 20th century. And I could show you sort of documents from like the 1940s where they're just sort of grossing about like, oh, our kids are leaving, we can't hold on to young people. This has been, and this really drove a lot of their 20th century economic development thing is like, we're if we lose youth, we can't reproduce ourselves as a society. We'll just sort of wither and die. But I mean, it has become, I feel like, just an epic problem in the 21st century as our economy becomes so geared towards tech, right? Towards finance, towards all of these things that require college degrees, if not sort of advanced degrees, and in which most of those industries are overwhelmingly drawn to urban places, right? I sort of made this joke one time that like, for all of the problems of like industrial development and trying to attract a factory in the years after World War II, there was like a democracy to it. Like most towns with like a relatively minimal amount of preparation could sort of get a little plant, right? I mean, the idea that they could get like a tech firm or they could lure a Silicon Valley startup to like, North Dakota without, fiber optics and things like that, and this really sort of sophisticated infrastructure is just inconceivable, right? So I think that there has been this clear situation where in the last 10 to 15 years, the youngsters, they go off to college, they leave their rural towns, they get a degree, and they couldn't even go back if they wanted to. I mean, there's just nothing for them to do there with their education. So they move off to the city. And then these communities don't have working age people, right? So if they're trying to attract a business, businesses are like, well, we're not going to come to a place that doesn't have enough like employees that's going to like work there. And it kind of becomes like this horrible death spiral. And I really don't know at this moment sort of how you like pull yourself out of that as it sort of continues to snowball and really sort of escalate in the last couple decades.
Yeah, it's depressing because, I'm from North Dakota. I'm living in New York, working in media. I have a bunch of friends from Des Moines, and none of them, live in Des Moines anymore. It's, it's a depressing thing. And a lot of us, like a lot of my friends who, when we were in Minnesota State, were on the journalism staff, we talk about like, it'd be nice to go back and like, do it there, but there's just not jobs there yet. Like we basically need to, like, in order to make that happen, we would need to establish ourselves significantly and then go I
mean, from my own experience, so I teach in like a rural small town in southern Ohio, and I lived there for the first few years I was working there. But then my wife finished residency as a doctor, and she wanted to do sort of research, a certain kind of sort of medical thing, and the only place she could really do that was like Ohio State. So now we live in Columbus, right? And it was, I was content there. It was fine, but it was just if you're looking for these certain kind of career opportunities, these places, it's very difficult to make work. And it's just, I think there's almost this desire on the part of people to want to situate themselves there, to want to build something, to want to sort of like be part of the fabric of these communities, but without, some way to make a living, it becomes just, nigh impossible.
So I wanted to ask you something, because we've covered, for example, like some of the farmland crisis, right? How like a lot of like big companies or like big firms are buying up a lot of farmland across the country. And I was just wondering like how this, like the real estate factor fits into all of this, right? Because I remember like there was a big article about how a bunch of former college football players, early NFL players, like they bought a lot of land in Iowa, like as a collective, right? And it was like, oh, great, they're so smart and whatever. I'm not getting worked up about them. But,
right.
There's this question is like, are there some winners out there from, the decline in rural life for a lot of people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are, right? I think, those who have survived the culling of farm modernization seem to be doing very well, right? Like those big farmers who are sort of situated very well, those who, I guess farmland is just insane. It is crazy how expensive it is. And so I think for some that have like invested in it as like their portfolio, right, it sort of worked out very, very well. And I mean, there are certain players that have like made out very well in the changes within the rural economy. For one, one thing I think about is like big banks, right? So, we've seen clearly that since the financial crisis of 2008, with like the bailout of the very large banks, that there's been just like incredible banking consolidation, right? A lot of rural small town banks have been sort of absorbed into these broader networks. They've been sort of taken over by these national things. And as a result, to some extent, I think there's been like this transfer of wealth, wherein when rural communities put their money in these regional sort of branch banks, that money is then eventually sort of makes its way back to the headquarters, inevitably located in some large metropolitan center. It's not clear that a lot of it's reinvested in local community stuff very frequently. And I think there have definitely been people that have made a killing from this sort of downward slide. And it's quite depressing. Another one's media, right? Like small newspapers have just been just eviscerated. They've just been absorbed into these ever-growing media networks. And, I look at like some small town newspaper sometimes, I'm like, this is just rehashed content from, when I look at the stuff I read for my book, it's all local like news. It's very much, there is some national coverage, but it's very much rooted in like what's going on in the community. And now it's just like, reprinted AP articles, reprinted stuff from the national, very little local coverage. And the sense that like, I'm sure those companies out there just like swallowing up the like local news infrastructure have done very well for themselves on this like business model.
Right. Yeah. What political wins do you think, or would you observe that this sort of, especially like neoliberalism to the great financial crisis? Like what would you remark on there?
Yeah, this is the big question, right? What we've seen, because there really did not. It was clear there was an inclination, right, on the part of rural voters towards, the Republican Party since the late 20th century. And also, sort of pro-business, sort of centrist neoliberal Democrats, tended to also do sort of fairly well. And then we've seen, sort of in the last, the 2010s, just this sort of hard right turn, right? How long-term that is going to be is a really interesting question. I've seen some analysis from the most recent midterms that there seem to be some sort of positive sites, that maybe the margins are kind of shrinking, and that one of the reasons why Democrats did relatively well in some places is they were able to sort of convince more rural voters than they had in the last few cycles. I'm not really sure, right? But I do think that what I see is a really pretty abrupt polarization of like the rural electorate towards a like Trump MAGA universe, right? Has a lot to do with just this big fallout from the Great Recession and the financial crisis, right? So the 2010s are just incredible. So let me give you some numbers. In the 1990s, non-metropolitan America gained 3.4 million people. In the 2000s, they gained 1.5 million people. In the 2010s, like rural America lost 300,000 people. So it's like this last decade has just been like a total Armageddon. Between like by 2010, they'd lost like 35% of their manufacturing jobs. By the time the Great Recession had sort of reached its bottom, you see this situation where I tell people this stat, it's always kind of blows my mind, is that as late as 2019, there were still fewer jobs in rural America than there had been in 2007.
Wow.
Before the Great Recession. So it's like they never recovered, right? And how that then translates into this big shift, I think, I'm a historian, so, my sort of opinion is it's going to probably take us a while to sort of unpack that and like get into, the headspace of sort of, whether or not it just created the groundwork for what is largely a movement that expresses itself in, sort of xenophobia and other kinds of, sort of prejudice and culture wars, or whether or not it was, the sort of tariffs, anti-China, anti-globalization, free trade rhetoric that a lot of rural folks were sort of drawn to with this political movement. This is something that's like hotly debated in political science. But yeah, I mean, if you look at it's just like the overlap is pretty perfect, that like the 2010s when the rural economy is just being laid to sort of waste, is when you see this just like dramatic collapse in what I would argue was a fairly sort of like sort of right of center, typically sort of voting population for the most part. But yeah.
How would you describe, and you kind of touched on this earlier, but work in rural America now? There's this book, I'm trying to remember what it was. Maybe it's Broken Heartland, but it goes into like make work in rural America, like farmers needing to supplement their income in down periods by basically, like, there's one where like famous program where a company would send them engines to tinker with in their garage, and it was marketed as this, oh, look at, you can make some extra money, and then it became a way of like, oh, you actually need to do this, you no longer have your period, which is like eternal to farmers, that like the winter months you have like recuperation. No, get your ass in the garage and go like fix this crankshaft.
It's like an 1820s putting out system. Like that's like I'm like literally imagine like it's like piecework from like the country economy of like New England and like this. It's like that's incredible. They like just return to the old business models, like the farm families. Like how interesting. Yeah,
actually, and this was from the 1996 book Broken Heartland: Rise of America's Rural Ghetto by Osha Gray Davidson. But like describe work, and what does post financial crisis like. Is it just like, to me, it's like, you got to move to Bismarck, you got to move to Fargo.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that I think is really fascinating is the way that like the entire political economy of rural America is basically held together by like absurd distances of commuting, right? Like it's crazy. Like we think about like our commutes, right? Like I talk to some of my students, and they're like, they will just like not even bat an eye. Like, oh yeah, my dad drives an hour and a half, 45 minutes, like because this is like the situation, right? For whatever reason, you find yourself with your residents in this, sort of open countryside. You like your acres, you like your situation, but like the jobs are sort of somewhere else, right? So you inevitably are spending a lot of time in your car, right? Maybe you'll listen to a lot of talk radio of a certain vintage. This might be another sort of thing. They spend a lot more time in their cars than do suburbanites and metropolitan Americans, right? They, sort of definitely have that as like a determining feature, right? And I mean, the kinds of work they do are often, very, very different. The industries that drive rural America, or tend to be still a lot of manufacturing, even though it's been sort of eviscerated. Rural America is still much more reliant upon manufacturing, construction, trucking. There's a great book by Shane Hamilton called Trucking Country that looks at like the sort of history of like rural truckers and sort of independent workers and owner operators. Remains like, I think, a big lifeline for a lot of rural Americans who, especially those without like a college degree, who are trying to strike this balance, right? The sort of trucking economy kind of keeps this all basically sort of functioning. Tons of, work in retail, in food services, in things like that. And just a disproportionate lack in those sort of other, sort of high-end fields, right? So I think, I mean, there are definitely sort of on paper, there's a lot of similarities, especially as, there still is agriculture, there's still mining, there's still forestry, they're all kind of a shell of their former selves, but they are still concentrated in rural areas that sort of make these places sort of distinctive, plus a lot of industries somehow sort of connected to them in sort of one way or another. But I do feel like there's, sort of this sense in rural America still that like, their work is still very much like blue collar, right? No matter of what vintage, it's still much more manual. It's work with, your hands and with your sort of muscles as opposed to with sort of your mind. And based on the just sort of economic sectors that thrive, I don't think that's necessarily sort of untrue, right? So I think, yeah, I think there are some distinctive differences, even though, like, you know, if you were to just look at it from like, you know, the census pullout, you're like, oh, they're all in service and like a smattering in manufacturing. And it's like, it's very, very similar to metropolitan areas, but there is like a very big, like, qualitative difference between the types of jobs a lot of them do and types of jobs that like metropolitanites do.
Is it, you know, there was, when talks like the COVID shift in a lot of more work from home and that sort of thing, to me, it seems like, you know, any sort of promise that might have had to equalize the situation has actually just turned out to richer people moving to like Butte and then driving up the housing prices. But is that basically the story going forward? As a historian, like, would that basically what you'd see?
Yeah, I mean, I heard these arguments too. There's like, every few weeks there'd be like some piece like, oh, people can move back to rural areas. I was like, well, like, there's the internet problem, right? Which is like, I mean, oh my God, when we switched to COVID, some of my rural students that had to like Zoom into classes, like they were just fucked, right? They could not like get it streaming. There were so many issues. Their internet. I had students that would just very regularly Zoom in from like the McDonald's parking lot because
that's got to be just, I mean, radicalized, because my girlfriend's going to nursing school and like that shift too. And like, these are people that are trying to get into the workforce as nurses.
Yes.
And literally we just don't have an infrastructure to provide them that opportunity to best, you know, prepare themselves. And that requires, and has always, like, rural electrification. This has always required state action.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, I think my book, one of the things that I really found is, you know, one of the reasons why I would argue there really has been a kind of centrist nature to a lot of rural politics since World War II is like, you know, the old sort of small town booster class was very aware. They're like, no company's going to come here if we don't have sewage and water and roads. And they're like, you know, they actually, you know, were big sort of behind and sort of investing to prepare this. I think what's happened since 2008, though, is like a lot of that class has just been devastated, right? Like the small banker, gone. They're just part of these big branches. The small newspaper editor, gone, right? They're just part of this big new situation. The people who oversee it may or may not have any attachment to the local community. On top of that, it seems like money for investment in small businesses and like local loans really sort of dried up with the consolidation of banking, right? When the mentality of these big branch banks is like, not how do we grow this local economy for secondary benefits because we live here. It's like, where can I get 6% back on my money versus 5%, right? There's no loyalty to this sort of communities anymore. And also just, I mean, I think the big problem too is like the aging of the population, right? I mean, as both the boomer rural cohort reaches, you know, this end of their working lives, I mean, a lot of them, they don't want to foot the bill anymore for bond issues to improve schools, right? Like their kids are out of the house. The rural population is getting so old. People don't want to pay for these investments because there's a sense that it doesn't benefit them. And if such a huge proportion of your population is like elderly and retirees, it's really difficult to get these things through. I mean, I've seen in the local town that I teach in, there's been a bunch of like efforts to pass a bond measure to fund the schools, and it just keeps failing.
I've heard that. I went to junior high in a 106-year-old junior high school in Mandan, North Dakota. It was like pulling teeth to get them to pass a new high school to eventually move people. And now I look, because there's all this oil money and the economy's kind of good and growing. They've been building schools like crazy. So it's wild how that has that impact.
Yeah. I mean, if the money's there, they'll do it. It's just how to sort of extract it from a population. It also appears that one of the big problems also seems that too is after 2008, a lot of states sort of cut off funding to local communities and we're kind of like, you got to kind of do your own thing because we have our own sort of cash flow. And I read one analysis that was like, a lot of states took this as an opportunity to do like a reset. So it was like, well, even though the crisis is over, like we're not going back to this old situation. We're going to sort of, eliminate those levels of funding on infrastructure. And like, if you need like an emergency one-time thing to fix your road, like we'll do that. But like continuous revenue sharing has really sort of dried up. And that collaboration between sort of different levels of government and local communities seems to have become much more, much more paltry. And I think that's like another big issue these communities have had is like once again, like how do you pull yourself out of this hole once it just keeps getting, that seems to be just getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And like, I mean, I don't have any answers, but I'm trying to at least kind of make sense of it.
It's not hard for me to imagine how I'd feel if I'd been in rural America this entire time and the central bank had been basically giving Silicon Valley money to invent very sophisticated chatbots while my entire community just dies.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think there have been some positive developments. I think if one thing that really can have a broad impact and is probably going to be very popular is the infrastructure bill. I think that'll be huge. I think the problem with that is that Republicans are so cagey with both voting against it and shutting it down. And then the moment the money comes in, they make it seem like look what's come in, and they claim credit for it and make it look like, so the sense of, whether or not it's even sort of understood that this was something delivered by a certain group, they always sort of like snatch the credit for that. But it
doesn't help that Pelosi acts embarrassed by it and like, this is a once in a lifetime thing. We promise we won't try it again. Yeah.
But I do think at the end of the day, like if we want to believe that like it's possible to live in a much less toxic and polarized society, like rebuilding rural America is like a good thing no matter what, right? Because my sense was from the book I've written is like when they have a sense of hope and that there's possibility that their communities can be revived, that there's some hope for growth and expansion, that it mediates, from really fringe-like politics. I mean, I think about, and it's not impossible. I mean, one thing I always like to tell people about that almost no one's ever heard about is like, do you guys realize that like there was a rural renaissance in the 1970s, right? Like the 1970s nationally is like supposed to be this hellscape of economic life, right? Like oil crisis. Rural America experienced like this golden age, right? It had huge increase in industrialization. It had really big job growth. For the first time, more people moved into rural America than left for eons. And it really reversed this tremendous free fall that the countryside had been in since World War II from agricultural consolidation, and really was achieved by, in large part, huge investments by the federal government, in the whole array of programs to create the conditions that made this possible. It can be done. Whether or not in the climate we're operating in, it can be done, who's to say?
Yeah, well, we kind of covered it a little bit, but I have a question. How did rural America birth both these populists, which we've had on the brain a lot recently, and these sort of like moderate political movements? But to me, I guess it's kind of clear. It's just like the different periods of time. You have the earlier version, and then you have post the like sort of 30s, 40s. You get more sort of a long march toward neoliberalism a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I think about too. I mean, one thing I always think about, because this is like the heart of like the what's the matter with Kansas question. Is like these places used to produce like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance and like the populist movement and things like that. One thing I've always been sort of just devastated by is like, this is very true, but like, oftentimes the political energy for those movements were coming from small farmers.
Yeah.
Right. It was, and I think one of the reasons we have failed to see a sort of progressive, anti-monopoly, anti-corporate movement come out of the countryside in recent decades with that same sort of ethos is like the small farmer is gone. Right. They're gone. I mean, I don't even know what the average size of a farm today is, but like it is massive, right? And that is this constituency that throughout almost all of American history has had this potential for, radical sort of, political mobilization and action. And it can't be drawn upon anymore because it has been essentially, sort of, its existence has come to an end by and large.
Right.
When that exactly, when is its end date? Who knows? But it's just like it is a very small constituency these days, and they had been really the bulwark of almost all of those movements.
Right, like in North Dakota, for instance, you had the populist movement do the grain elevator because the grain elevator capitalists were screwing you over. You do, and then state bank also because the bankers screwing you over, and
Right.
and also like the anti-rail stuff that was also farmers getting screwed over by rates.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
I was actually just reading this book, this old Gilded Age book called The Octopus by Frank Norris, which is all about these farmers battling it out with the sort of the railroad. And it's a really great text. But yeah, I mean, it is sort of this question of and this is something I sort of grapple with very often, it's like, so if we want to try and build something in rural America, right? Who do we look to, right? Who is the constituency? Do you want to look? Is it the Walmart employee, this retail service sector, sort of building off things like the unionization of Starbucks and things like that? It's like, is that the model? The old industrial working class is tough because it's in decline and it's dispersed, right? The small farmers kind of gone. So I think it's just sort of trying to conceptualize new constituencies, new blocks, as well as new structures and institutions. That's one thing I always sort of try to explain to people. They ask, well, why didn't after 2008, why didn't they tack left, right? Like, why didn't they just sort of respond to this capitalist? And I was like, our forces are very thin in the countryside, right? There is not a great presence there to have channeled that. Whereas, business, chamber of commerce folks, they're very present. Churches, right? At that moment, it was the infrastructure was sort of just not very ready to act. But Dave, you were gonna.
No, I mean, I just want to ask you, because I've been working on something for Jacobin on the early history of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union.
Yeah,
and it's one of those things that's so interesting to read. There's a lot of stuff that's interesting there, but the question I want to ask you is that whenever they would go into a small town, they knew where people were.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? They knew where people hung out, and there was the sociability there. And I think a lot of people are sort of cognizant of how that sort of declined across American society. But is it a similar kind of decline in sociability, bowling clubs, that kind of thing in rural America as well?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. I mean, I think it is. There's as it becomes more of a dispersed society, right? I mean, my sense is, there's sort of less of this familiarity. But that's the thing, right? But I will say this, having lived in one of these communities, I noticed there is a great sense of sociability amongst kind of the local elites, right? They all kind of they're on a lot of boards, they're on a lot of organizations, they all kind of hang out, they hold a lot of things for the Rotary, right? But there is not the institutional sort of density for sort of other groups that we used to have, right? The sense of we'll all join the Elks or I'll join the right? Especially amongst sort of the younger people, that sort of way of uniting has kind of declined. And I think that is one of the problems of how you then who it is that's sort of communicating and interacting and who is very disconnected and, not in dialogue with one another. Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
Well, I mean, this is a little tedious, but last thing I want to ask you, just because it's a pet peeve of ours. Anytime something bad happens in rural America, particularly red states, there's always these, it's a meme at this point, right? The basically red states, rural parts of the country, they're just moochers. They're stealing from us, nice fancy folk in the cities. I mean, how would you respond to that?
I mean, I think that's just I'm never of the mindset that the government distributing more to some people. I also find that just so interesting because it's often coming from people who consider themselves left liberal. And I was but you would defend this to the death if this were Social Security or payments to, families like in cities who are just like scraping by, right? Like, but
it's like they think the guys driving big trucks with truck nuts are like welfare kings or something like that, and it's like that's not where that money's going.
Yeah. Exactly. It's going to, and I think the thing that's unfair is like, it's like, oh, well, this is like, government money being, and I was like, well, but like, I mean, there have been a lot of ways public policy has kind of favored cities, like you said, doling out money to like Silicon Valley and tech industry to do all this R&D that has like made them so much more wealthy and prosperous, and why they have such an incredible tax base. But it's also this sense that like, yeah, it's like, oh, well, they're like, look, they're getting this bonanza and they have so much more political weight. I was like, then why are their economies such shit? Like, you're acting like they're like living this like this just like this bounty of just like government dollars and political power, and they're just like, I was like, they're all way poorer than you. Yeah. They all have sort of much like worse jobs. Like, these communities are like eroding. There's all of these issues, and yet there's this sense that somehow they're like reaping this sort of unfair advantage. So I always think that's just, but I also just think it's counterproductive, and it serves no useful purpose. If you just want to punch down at people who are getting disproportionate Social Security and unemployment, other things, like, so be it, and just feel like sanctimonious in your dislike of them because they already kind of don't vote or behave the way you like, then like, okay, like you can have your moment, but like politically, I'm like, I see no problem in trying to help poor people no matter where they live, right? And also that we can, this is just burning bridges, and you're kind of reaffirming all the horrible stereotypes about what they think you believe that you deny are real.
Right.
They're like, we don't look down on these people. We don't think they're backwards or stupid. It's like, but they're
but we do
stupid political decisions, and I hate them. And
and it's so immature too, because like, one, like that money, to the extent it is going to people, it's because they're poor or like aging population, and need those sort of programs. But also a good chunk of that money is also spent to help people extract more from those regions too. So like, the idea that it's just going to Trump voters to vote Trump next time, like it's very small-minded.
I mean, this subsidization argument is just, well, I mean, that was just like, I don't know what got into him. I think he's stopped because it produced so much bad. But Paul Krugman was just on this. He was on this tear for a few weeks. It's just like, it's just like we have to give them all our money and then kiss their ass, otherwise we offend them, and then they just don't, but they brought this all on themselves. I'm like, okay, well,
sure, Princeton, sure.
Well, also, I think one comment he made, one of those, he was like, I have never once heard anyone in New York City say anything like demeaning about people in like rural and like middle America. I was like, were you living in a different New York City than I was?
No, I mean, my joke is whenever I told people I was from Texas when I was living in New York, there's always this awkward pause where they were expecting me to like apologize or like attack like my family. You know what I mean?
I remember a great story. This is a great story. Is a professor I knew at the University of Arkansas. He had gotten his PhD at Columbia like I did. And he, when he first got his job out of graduate school, he went to one of his professors and he was like, "Oh, I heard you got a job." Like, he's like, "Where is it?" He's like, "The University of Arkansas." And the guy's like, "Extraordinary." Arkansas? What a mystical idea, right? It's just like extraordinary. Like, it's like, I always love that. It's just like the, I mean,
it's truly amazing. Just like Narnia.
Exactly.
Keith Orejel, you can follow him at Keith Dorejel. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This has been a blast. Yeah.
We'll talk to you again soon.